quite frankly, it's borderline racist. Some of your questions that you're putting here.
Is it really?
Yeah,
to ask the question about how someone identifies and how it is that the legislation, the framework does that in a practical, that's racist, is it?
Borderline, yes.
Borderline racist, is it really? In light of the fact that we're about to embark on a referendum with respect to the voice, obviously it raises issues of identity, becomes a very critical issue. So I'm wondering, straight off the bat, if someone can tell me who is it that decides who is Aboriginal and how do they do it?
Thank you for that. We've got relevant officer coming to the table. What I would say is that there was a test around Aboriginality that was set out in the Mabo decision, the three-part test, and that has continued to guide the Commonwealth Government and other governments in terms of the definition of Aboriginality. But I'll just see if Mr Lewis has anything to add to that.
The only thing I would add to that, Senator, is if I think the Secretary is quite right. There's a legal test that's been recognised in a number of cases. I think it's also the case that the Australian Government might not applies a different approach sometimes in relation to different programs, depending on what's considered to be appropriate. I'll leave it at that.
So do you want to step me through that? And what does that look like? So somebody says, I want to go to Parliament under the voice and I'm Aboriginal. How does that work?
Well, if the question is directly in relation to the voice, I mean, I guess I'll just start by saying that the agency that's leading the policy work on the voice is the National Indigenous Australians Agency. But my understanding is that at this stage there's been a draft constitutional amendment proposed by the Prime Minister, and questions such as who would be eligible to be a member of the voice or who would participate in choosing members is a matter that would be dealt with in any legislation establishing the voice or in the establishment of the voice in some manner. So
that sounds very complicated. Under normal circumstances, there is a three-part test based on dissent, identification and acceptance by community in broad terms. That's basically it?
That's right.
So is that likely to be, I mean, that is the generally accepted and I would say difficult assessment of, it's adopted by the legislation, some of the court decisions?
Mr Lewis, I think there's two parts to the Senator's questions. One is a general question and then the second part is around the voice. So I think the general question hasn't been answered yet.
Thank you, Chair. So I think the general question is that what you've outlined, Senator, is a summary of the test that's commonly applied. The question of exactly what the arrangements will be for the voice is something, a matter for the government in consultation with others, and I understand that no decisions have been made about that at this stage.
And so in relation to the three-part test though, how is a person going to ever be able to prove their descent? What is that going to look like? Is it going to look like having one grandparent or a great-grandparent that was Aboriginal, and how is that going to be proven in enough to satisfy any constitutional provisions that may be required in order to enter that body?
Well, Senator, again, I would say that the question as to how these matters will be determined in relation to the voice.
Let's say right now, as of today, you want to establish your lineage as a person. How would that work today?
Well, Senator, as I said, my understanding, and it's not an area within my policy responsibilities or even the department, but I understand that for different purposes, different types of tests are applied. If there is a test that requires an element of dissent, then that might be shown by reference to documents provided by the Aboriginal person in question.
Right at the moment now, we're dealing with agencies including First Nations justice policy, and so on and so forth. There has to be somebody in this room. There are about 60 people in this room here, all looking very important. There has to be someone in this room that can answer the question, though, of how someone goes about physically proving or practically proving the lineage for the purpose of whatever it may be. Let's put the voice aside for a moment. What percentage does somebody have to be of Aboriginal descent to be deemed Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander?
Senator, I think I wouldn't be using that type of language, which...
Well, if you're 95% Irish, Scottish, are you going to be 5%? Are you going to be eligible for the voice to Parliament?
I think getting into a conversation about percentage is not appropriate. There is a very long-standing test that's been set out in a High Court decision that everyone takes regard to.
So my question is, how does that operate practically? And no one can seem to tell me the answer to that. We haven't even got to the second and third limbs of that test yet. You can understand how there'd be cause for concern when we can't even identify what it is on a practical basis that will identify someone as of a particular ethnic category. That is of concern, I would have thought.
What I would say, and what I think what my colleagues have indicated, is this test goes back to the Mabo decision.
Sure.
I understand it has been utilised.
Senator Antic,
I understand the history of it.
Senator Antic, you will let the Secretary... Senator Antic, please let the Secretary finish her answer.
What I am saying in a practical way, that has guided how people can interact with a whole range of Commonwealth programs for decades now. I think officers at the National Indigenous Australians Agency will be able to give you much more detail of how that happens practically, but that has been the guiding test for decades now.
The Attorney General's Department, the department that is given the responsibility of overseeing legislation in this country, cannot tell me what I would have to do in order to identify as Aboriginal for the purposes of any of these. Just give me one example.
Well, I think, as I've said, it's set out. It's around establishing ancestry. It's about being accepted by the relevant community, and it's about self-identification.
So what happens then if the community, for political purposes, simply rejects someone on the basis of their descent?
I think you're putting forward hypotheticals.
But your government, Minister, is in the process of legislating, or trying to legislate, taking to a referendum one of the most important constitutional reforms of our lifetimes. And nobody can tell me how we define the category we're looking for.
I think that's an important point you make there, that we are hopefully going to be legislating this one day. And
hopefully you'll have some answers.
As a member of Parliament, you will have the opportunity to have input into that.
Yeah, I would like to if there were more information, but there is. What happens?
You're talking in hypotheticals.
No, we're not
riddles.
talking in hypotheticals.
I know what you're seeking to achieve. Quite frankly, it's borderline racist. Some of your questions that you're putting here.
Is it really?
Yeah,
to ask the question about how someone identifies and how it is that the legislation, the framework, does that in a practical... That's racist, is it?
Borderline, yes.
Borderline racist, is it really?
The path that you're going down.
Is it really? Yeah.
If that's where you want to head, Senator Antic...
Well, I just want an answer. What I'm looking for is a simple answer.
We're here. The department have given you
no answers
an
whatsoever.
answer to this. It might not be one that you're satisfied.
Well, it's not an answer. I'm not satisfied with no answer.
One that is being answered by the Secretary and the department.
So look, I'm going to wind this up because this is really not helpful. But is it the case that therefore that you cannot tell me that if I have a 10% lineage as a person, an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person, that will be enough, or in order to qualify for any of these legislative provisions? Nobody here can tell me who actually is an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander person for the purposes of the law in this country.
I don't think that's correct, Senator. And as I said, there is a long-standing Commonwealth Convention. It's that three-part test, and that test is utilised, has been utilised for decades to, in legal contexts, in the context of access to programs, and is well established.
Here's a final question, Chair. Are you concerned that this process is going to lead to people who wrongly identify themselves as Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander or Aboriginal becoming qualified for The Voice, for whatever other program it may be?
I think you're sort of asking a question that is based around a hypothetical.
Right. The whole thing's hypothetical.
Sorry?
The whole thing's hypothetical. There's not a single answer. There's just not a single... nobody seems to be able to tell me what qualifies for the purposes of this categorisation. So it could just be anybody. Anybody's just going to be able to...
No, you have to meet the three-part test.
Which you can't describe.
I think I have
described it.
You haven't described it. So, Minister, in practical terms, what does it look like when you say what does it take to prove dissent in this country?
Well, I think
what does it take?
The Secretary had said, there's legal precedent in that regard.
What does it take, Minister? What do you have to do
Senator
practically?
Antic, the Minister is answering your question.
Well, he's not
if you'd
really.
like to let him answer it. You might not like the answer, but he's going to be able to give it. I appreciate that. You might not like the answer, but the Minister is answering it.
In practical terms, what does it look like?
Senator Antic, do not interrupt me. I haven't given a ruling, but I've given you a clear direction to stop.
As the Secretary was saying, there's been well-established legal precedent in this regard and how it applies to government policies. It operated under your government when you guys were in power.
We weren't legislating
and nothing
for
has
a
changed
race-based division.
Well, that is just completely untrue.
Well, were we?
Huh?
Well, so we were.
What I'm saying is the
legislating
legal
before.
precedent was applied when you guys were in government, and it's the same one that still applies today.
Your government.
In terms of The Voice,
Okay.
what we have said is that further details would be legislated after hopefully a successful outcome in the referendum.
So
the opportunity for opposition members of parliament is to engage in that process in good faith.
So that's what
I
we're
don't
trying to
see a
do.
lot of
That's
it
what we're
from
trying to do
Senator
today
Antic.
to get a simple answer. Thank you, Chair. My last question.
Last
This is
Senator Antic.
quite extraordinary in the sense that I could sit here for the better part of 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and still not be able to have that question, that simple question about what it would take to identify as an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander in this country, and nobody in this room can answer it.